So now that we've talked about clinical data management systems or clinical databases, we want to turn our attention to a component of the clinical database, sort of an addition, which is going to be the electronic data capture piece. Now what this refers to is collecting the clinical data in an electronic form instead of on a paper case report form or some other document. Now, as we've learned earlier, when sites transcribe papers, case report forms, the data on the case report form is entered into the clinical database by someone at the sponsor or at the CRO. So what we're going to see as we move along is that process is going to be a little bit different with our electronic data capture systems. Our learning objectives for Introduction to Electronic Data Capture are going to be to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of EDC, also to describe some common features of EDC systems, and to compare and contrast the characteristics of an EDC system versus a paper-based system. So this will help you understand the differences and the similarities between the two. So this graphic illustrates how the electronic data capture system touches all of these other functions, all of these other systems that we are going to encounter during the course of our trial. So if we take a look at the top, or take a look at the center, we've got our EDC system in the center. And then we've got a series of other systems around, and it's going to, in many cases, it's going to touch all of them. So if we start at the top, we have ePro, which is our electronic patient-reported outcomes. So this could be, say, a device or maybe an app that might be on a cell phone or a smartphone where a patient might enter, say, dosing data. And that would be something that they enter it and then they send it in. They send a text message essentially, and the data gets entered directly into the database. So our EDC system is going to touch that because we're probably going to have some queries and things like that come up. Also, our clinical trial management system is going to be the database that where we collect all of our operational data for our clinical trial. We keep track of our patients in there. We keep track of the visits that they come to. We keep track of all the staff that are at the various sites. That's all kept in there. Anything that's not actual clinical data is going to be kept in the clinical trial management system. Then we also have a safety database that's going to contain serious adverse event data, and our safety folks are going to deploy that. So our EDC system is going to touch that one. Then also IVRS, which is our interactive voice response system, or you might see that as an interactive web response system. This is going to be the system that we get a randomization codes from. As we're screening patients and we're ready to enroll them, we go through a randomization process, and then that process assigns the patient to a specific treatment arm. And then finally, we've got reporting tools. We've talked about these. Some of them are business intelligence or business objects, crystal reports, JReview, a few others that we may use in order to extract data from our database. And then finally, we've got CDISC, which is our Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium. And we're going to learn more about that as we go along in our class. But our EDC system is going to hit some of the standards that are associated with CDISC. Some of the advantages of using an EDC system, it enables sites to enter data directly into the clinical database. It eliminates paper CRFs and the costs that are associated with those. There are a lot of costs there. You have printing costs. You've got to store those paper CRFs someplace. Then you've got to process them once they come in. So it can be a very costly endeavor. It also eliminates the data entry step done in the paper CRF process. So you're foregoing that piece. You're not transcribing the data onto paper. You're entering it directly into a database. And then finally, it makes data available for validation faster. Presumably, sites can record their data, can enter their data more quickly than they can with a paper CRF system. And so that's going to give our sponsors faster access to the data itself. Other advantages to using an EDC system: it improves the query response time because instant queries can prompt sites for data correction. We've talked about some of those in our past classes. It also improves data security by using user IDs and passwords to view and enter data. It also shortens the time required to review the data by eliminating double data entry. Ordinarily, with a paper study, we'd get the paper CRFs in, one person would enter the data, then another person would come along and enter the exact same data. And again, then any errors, any discrepancies would be quickly identified. So it eliminates that step. And then finally, it allows the remote data review by the data management staff, monitors, medical monitors, etc. And it allows data clarification queries to be sent instantly and electronically, so we don't have any paper data clarification forms. It also shortens the time required for a site to answer a query. Paper queries can cost as much as $80 to $100, $120 to resolve, where EDC queries cost a lot less. Now, on the other hand, because they're easier to send out, you wind up sending out more of them than you do in a paper study. But essentially, we're going to cut down some of the cost associated with these paper studies by using the EDC system. And then finally, it reduces the risk of lost CRF pages. So obviously, if there's not some tangible page, it can't get lost. There are some disadvantages to using EDC systems. Sites need to be trained, and that costs money. You can always have technical problems that occur. Computers break. You lose internet connections, things like that. You also have more people that have access to your data. So that can be a risk as well. And then sponsor companies have to update their standard operating procedures or work instructions to accommodate using an EDC system because the processes are going to be a little bit different. So there's cost associated with doing that. Some additional disadvantages: you have to have user support, and that costs money. So you may have to have a 24/7 help desk available to help users with their problems that they associate with. You have edit checks, must be more thoroughly tested. You don't want to send any bad queries out to the site, so you've got to test those a little easier, a little more thoroughly. And then finally, you've got the query process is easier to execute, and so the data management staff is less reluctant to send a query. So therefore, when I mentioned earlier that it probably leads to more queries being sent, that's probably one of the reasons why that is so. Some of the common features of electronic data capture systems: you may have an electronic CRF designer or eCRF. This allows the pages to look like paper CRFs. So when you see them on your screen, they look like a form that you would fill out with a pencil or a pen. This also aids in creating electronic case report forms. It also ensures that edit checks work correctly, and it can be used across multiple trials. So that can cut down on the cost associated with creating these electronic case report forms. So for our data entry, once the protocol is set, the EDC system permits data to be entered onto the appropriate form or eCRF page. So once we've got our protocol approved and we've got our eCRF pages approved and our site personnel has been trained and they are capable of doing it, we can go ahead and start entering data. So query management was one of the features of our electronic data capture. Once the edit checks fire and identify data discrepancies, then queries can be managed fairly efficiently. A query status falls into conventional categories. You have draft queries or unreviewed queries. Nothing's been done with them. Then you may have a status of sent, which means it's been sent to the site to be answered. Then your answered query is one that the site has responded back to, and it needs to be resolved by our data management staff. And then we have a closed query, which means it's been reviewed, it's been answered, been resolved, and we've closed it. And then finally, we may have a status of hold, where the query is in a hold status for some sort of specific reasons. Maybe we're waiting on it. Maybe we're waiting for more information from the site in order to before we can actually close it. So those would be the various statuses of individual queries in our query management system. So here are some facts about EDC implementation. As of 2013, almost half of all new clinical trials are initiated using EDC as opposed to using paper. The use of EDC is expected to increase by 14.7% annually, and then the total cost will be around $3.1 billion. So it's still a fairly small market when compared to other big database markets, but it's changing, and the tools are getting a lot more robust. So electronic data capture major functions, requirements, and issues related to user support. You've got to have the availability of standard operating procedures. You've got to have adequate training for each user, and you can't allow them access to the system until they've been trained. You have to have support of the software provider when needs arise. Every once in a while, we'll discover some sort of systemic problem with the database, and our software provider is going to need to be able to work with that and fix it. Then we've got a change in the workflow related to data entry. We no longer do the first and second pass, so our workflow is going to change a little bit. And sites and sponsors report much longer lag times. So some of those issues may not be exactly positive for us, but they're nevertheless part of the EDC effort. So let's talk for a moment about access administration. Basically what we're talking about is user authorization, user access to the system. We want it to be limited to data entry, access rights, and privileges. We also want to be able to use be able to identify users either by using a user ID and a password to identify them so that we know when they're in the system and we know what data they're entering and changing. The documentation of the system takes time. You've got to develop training programs for them to use, and all that takes time. And then finally, we've got to have physical security, specifically of the servers and computers that we're using with our EDC system. So we want to have data security, which are going to be protections against data manipulation. So we don't want just anybody being able to go in there and make a change to a specific piece of data rather. We want well-built backups and contingencies in case we run into a problem. Then finally, we need human readability of data after systems change, and this is huge. As I mentioned earlier, this is part of the FDA regulation. 21 CFR Part 11 requires that any data that's in there needs to be human readable. So we know what it is, who entered it, who changed it, all of that. We also have data validation. This is going to require a validation standard that includes documenting. So we need to be able to document how the data has been validated. We need definition of entry checks, edit specifications, etc. So these are the pieces of the validation portion that we need to do as well. And very important that we have an audit trail. Our audit trail records all changes in a viewable and reportable audit trail, so we know who did it, when they did it, and what the change was. And we need consistency of variable data of the same kind. Does it match? Is it the same? We'll get into some of those as we move along with different data types, but it's very important that we be able to do that. So finally, we have system validation, and what we want to be able to do here, we want to be able to demonstrate to a regulator, can our system be validated and by whom? And is validation against some type of known standard? So those are two questions that we want to ask ourselves regarding our EDC system. So in our next segment, we're going to do a comparison between paper-based CRS system and an eCRS system using Oracle Clinical. So a couple of definitions I want you to be aware of. RDC is a term that you'll see specifically with Oracle, and it means remote data capture, which is it's the same thing as electronic data capture. They just use the word remote instead of electronic. Then, of course, you know what a case report form is. An electronic case report form is just on the clinical database, part of the clinical database, as opposed to an actual form that you fill out. Then DCI is data collection instrument, which think of that as just the same thing as a single CRF page. And then data collection module is actually a collection of variables or fields that you would see on the CRF page. So it might be one field or it might be a couple different fields. But that's what data collection module refers to. Then, of course, CDM is clinical data management, and CRA is the clinical research associate. So as we go through our comparison between paper-based CRS system and an eCRS system, I'm going to show you a table which is going to indicate a series of tasks. And then it's going to indicate how what's associated with that task for a paper study versus a remote data capture study or EDC study. So for example, in the first one here, we've got data collection. We have to be able to collect data. For paper, we use paper CRFs, and for the EDC system, we use entry screens or electronic case report forms. For the database specification, on the paper trial, we're going to have an annotated CRF and a database specification table. For the EDC system, we're going to have a mock screen layouts or equivalent, and that's how we're going to create our database. We also want to have a qualifying value. So on a paper study, that could be a page number. Then in the EDC study, it might be a data collection module subset number. So they both refer to the same thing. So moving along on our task, we have a database/screen testing. For the paper study, we would do this CDM test the same as we would otherwise. For the EDC system, we'll do CDM, clinical, and client review of screens and database functionality. So a lot of other people are going to get involved in looking at those data entry screens and validating them and signing off on them. Our data entry for a paper study, we're going to have first and second pass data entered. For the EDC study, we don't have to do the second pass because somebody at the site is going to enter it directly. Then we might have univariates, which are single variables with only one single data point. And then all univariates are processed at the time of entry for a paper system. And then mandatory univariates are processed after data saved as complete. So all other univariates are processed at the time of entry. So in other words, you're entering the data, you run into an issue, make a mistake, it automatically fires a query that asks you to fix it. That's what that means. So for edit checks, for our paper study, edit checks are performed after the database is put in production. So then edit checks are executed nightly via a scheduled batch validation. So we'll run it each night, and then in the morning when we come back in, we'll find all the discrepancies that fired during the batch process. So for the EDC study, we want edit checks. They're going to be released with the database when it goes into production. And then we're also going to have edit checks that fire once data is entered. So it's an immediate thing versus a batch thing. So for query processing, basically on a paper study, our data management staff is going to process and close almost all queries. For the EDC system, we're going to have other people involved in that. We may have CRAs or monitors that review and close out queries in addition to our data management staff. And then finally, patient data updates to the database. With a paper system, somebody in data management performs that update. In the EDC system, someone from the site, personnel that's been trained, is going to update data as necessary. So for database modifications, such as design or structural changes, for a paper study, the programmer can perform those modifications, based on communication with the internal project team. For an EDC study, essentially the same thing happens. Programmer performs a modification, and then the study database may be unavailable for a time while that modification is being made. Then also for database quality control, for a paper study, clinical data management reviews the CRF against the data in the database to ensure that it's accurate. For an EDC study, the CRA, the monitor that's on site, reviews the database against the source documents that are there at the site to ensure that they've been entered accurately. And then finally, signatures for a paper study. The investigator is going to sign the paper CRF and also the DCF form and send that back in to the sponsor or to the CRO. For EDC study, the investigator applies their electronic signature to the electronic case report form. Then for audit trails, for paper system, we probably need to identify the reason for changing data. It's applied by clinical data management. Also remember that when we make a change, we want to just mark through it with a single mark, and then initial and date when that change was made, so that you don't obscure it. Then with the EDC system, the reason for changing the data is supplied by the site, and we can know through our audit trail, who performed that change. And then finally, study archival. For a paper study, the site's going to store all the paper CRFs and all the queries that they get. For an EDC system, the site stores the eCRF data, the electronic queries, and electronic records are going to be burned onto a CD and made available to the site once the trial closes. This table shows you some of the differences between Oracle Clinical, Metadata Rave, and also another product called Open Clinical. And you can see on there, it's got the name of the vendor. It also has whether or not there's a license agreement, safety reports, whether or not security complies with 21 CFR Part 11, what kind of data import-export capability it has. So you can see that most of the systems are fairly similar, but there's a few differences between some of the popular EDC systems. So over these next series of slides, I'm going to show you what some of these EDC systems look like. So if you're working on one, it will look like this once you pull it up. So if you look at this first screen, this is obviously the change password screen, but you can see up in the upper left corner where you've got a series of tabs. So one might show you all the patient case books. Then you may have a tab that has a workflow to it on the review, and then a series of reports that are available to run on that series of pages. Here's another screen that shows you some of the EDC icons or something similar to that you might see. So if you look on here, you see in the upper left corner where you've got entry status. So the graphic there with the little green arrow pointing to the right, indicates that we're expecting to make some entries on that page. Maybe the patient's been in for a visit, but we haven't recorded the data yet. Then as you continue to go look down that screen, you'll see where discrepancies, you've got a graphic there for active discrepancies that's in red. So those are the ones we want to look at. And then also you've got some graphics there for verification and approval, as well as for locking. So any screen or any eCRF pages that are locked, maybe they're due to a data freeze or some other reason, they're going to show up with that little padlock there on their icon. So here's an example of a view in Oracle RDC on-site. If you'll remember in our first graphic that I showed you, you notice the tabs there along the upper right or upper left corner. As you can see in this one, we're looking at the case books. So we've got a patient number down at the bottom in that third column over from the left. And then we also have a series of graphics there. So we've got a number of pages where we're expecting to enter some data. And then we got some others where we have some queries that are outstanding, those ones that are in red. So we probably want to take a look at those and see if we can get those resolved. So here would be another view of our Oracle EDC system. As you can see there, we're now into the ECRF workflow. So we might want to identify our sponsor, the study, the site number, then that would pull up our ECRF data that we want to get to. So this is how that would be represented. So here's an example of what an electronic case report form would look like. You can see from this screenshot here that this is a medical history page. So you can see as you move down the form, you enter the patient number, the patient's initials, which visit it is, and then the same as we did on our paper CRF, you've got the different body systems there that or different categories where you would enter information that's related to the patient's history. So it's very much the same as our paper CRF page. The only difference is we're entering it directly into the database. So here's another view of a CRF page. You can see this one contains some lab data. So you can see there where it looks like one of them's in red. That's probably a lab value that's outside the range. It has a query on it that we need to identify. But you can see there, this is going to be some lab data that's kind of similar to what you're used to seeing. If you go to the doctor and you get your lab report back, you're familiar with some of those terms. So here's our final screenshot here. This is showing adverse event data for patient R1001. And you can see there, you've got the verbatim term that's in the center. You can see the first two lines there. It says headache and then neck pain. And then notice as you move down to that fourth line where they've entered malignant mast cell tumors. So they've indicated that over in the next to last column where a serious adverse event is equal to yes. So that's how you could identify where your serious adverse events are. So we record that. It's very much the same as we did with our CRF exercise in class. So finally, we get down to our Blackboard assignment for the second session for this week. So I want you to read chapter 20 in your book. This is going to be discussing EDC systems. And then we have a discussion board question, which is based on your reading and what you've learned in class, would you rather work on an EDC or a paper-based system? And I want you to explain why. So there's no right or wrong answer here, but I do want you to please support your answer with some specific information that we talked about either in class or that you discovered from your reading or that you learned about in the lecture. So please do that and get that up there this week, and I'll take a look at it as we move throughout the week.